The Hunting of the Bismarck, the North Atlantic, 1941. A vast wilderness of steel-grey water, whipped by wind and scarred by storms. To the east lies a continent, under the boot of tyranny. To the west, the last embattled bastion of hope, Britain, her lifeline stretched thin across the sea. This is no ordinary ocean. It is the lifeblood of an island empire. And into these waters, like a predator slipping from its lair, comes the most formidable warship ever built by Germany. Sleek, colossal, bristling with firepower. A vessel whose very name would send a shudder down the Admiralty's spine. Bismarck. She was not just a ship. She was a declaration. Bismarck towered above the dockyards like a cathedral of steel. Her grey flanks stretched the length of 3 football fields, displacing over 50,000 tons at full load, her bows knifing forward with a predatory curve. Beneath her armoured decks lay engines so vast they could drive her hulking mass across the Atlantic faster than most cruisers, faster even than many destroyers sent to hunt her. Her main armament dominated the skyline. 8 15-inch guns, housed in turrets the size of houses, each barrel capable of hurling a shell heavier than a small car at supersonic speed, aimed at targets more than 20 miles away. The impact of one hit could tear through steel bulkheads, detonate magazines, or rip the cruiser in half. Around these giants bristled her secondary weapons, batteries of 5.9-inch guns, rapid-firing anti-aircraft mounts, layers upon layers of teeth designed to tear apart anything that drew close. And then there was her armour. A belt more than 12 inches thick ran along her sides, sloped and angled to deflect incoming fire. Above and below it, steel decks layered like shields, designed to withstand anything short of a perfect hit from another battleship's main guns. To the men who studied her lines from afar, she seemed less a ship than an iron citadel, a floating fortress, impervious and unassailable. But the awe she inspired was matched by dread, for every sailor in the Royal Navy knew if Bismarck broke free into the Atlantic, she could rip the arteries of Britain's lifeline. Merchant convoys would burn, escorts would be obliterated, the island might starve. It was not her guns alone, nor her armour, nor her speed. It was the totality of her, a machine of war seemingly beyond human scale, a predator in a sea of prey. The Second World War was already raging. France had fallen, Norway was occupied, and the Kriegsmarine, Hitler's navy, sought to cut Britain's throat by severing its sea routes. U-boats prowled the depths, wolf packs sinking merchant convoys in their hundreds. But the U-boat menace, though deadly, was understood. Britain had begun to adapt, with radar, code-breaking, and convoys. The true nightmare was something else. A single battleship, modern, fast, and virtually impregnable, slipping into the Atlantic could wreak havoc beyond imagination. Merchantmen, escorts, even cruisers would be little more than prey. One ship could strangle the flow of food, fuel, and weapons keeping Britain alive. The Germans now had such a ship, the Bismarck, and she was launched in February 1939 from the Blohm & Voss shipyards in Hamburg. One British observer, seeing her under construction before the war, described her as a leviathan of the modern age, half cathedral, half guillotine. The man given command of this weapon was Admiral Günther Lütjens. He was not a Nazi zealot, but a professional sailor, cautious, cool, and disciplined. His task was not to seek glory in battle, but to execute a surgical strike against Britain's supply lines. By May 1941, the plan was set. Operation Rheinübung, the breakout into the Atlantic. Bismarck, escorted by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, would slip through the Denmark Strait, the icy channel between Greenland and Iceland, and fall upon the merchant arteries Britain depended on. But Britain was watching. Ever since Bismarck's fitting out, Churchill and the Admiralty had dreaded her first sortie. "Sink the Bismarck," Churchill declared. "That is our prime duty." Code breakers, spies, and aerial reconnaissance all strained to follow her movements. When word came that she was readying for sea, the trap was set in motion. Picture it: Hamburg Harbour in May 1941. A grey dawn, gulls wheeling, the smell of oil and iron. Dock workers stop in their tracks as the Leviathan stirs. Chains rattle, lines are cast, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Bismarck begins to move. One sailor later wrote in his diary, "She moved like a mountain come to life." I felt proud, yes, but also small. We knew we were part of something vast and dangerous, a gamble written in steel. As Bismarck slid down the Elbe, German propaganda trumpeted her as the hammer that would smash the Royal Navy. Yet Lucians himself, staring from the bridge, carried a colder expression. He knew the odds. Britain still possessed a larger navy, and though many of its ships were older, they were battle-tested. If Bismarck were found, she would be hunted relentlessly. Still, orders were orders, and Hitler wanted a blow against Britain's heart. On the British side, the tension was almost unbearable. Reports trickled in, conflicting, fragmentary. Some said Bismarck was still at Kiel. Others hinted she was refuelling in Norway. Admiral Sir John Tovey, commander of the Home Fleet, wrestled with the problem: scatter his ships across the ocean in hopes of intercepting her, or keep them concentrated to strike with overwhelming force. Churchill's pressure was unrelenting. The Prime Minister understood better than most the symbolic weight of the moment. Britain had been battered, but not broken. If Bismarck rampaged unchecked, faith in Britain's survival would falter both at home and abroad. The order went out. Every available unit of the Royal Navy was to turn its eyes north. From Scapa Flow, from Iceland, from the Atlantic patrols, great grey shapes shifted course, bows slicing through cold seas. Old but majestic vessels like HMS Hood, pride of the fleet. Newer giants like HMS Prince of Wales, her paint hardly dry. Cruisers, destroyers, even aircraft carriers joined the hunt. It was the largest concentration of British naval power in years, all to corner a single ship. Let's pause here to feel the scale. Imagine the Atlantic not as an empty blue expanse on a map, but as a living, breathing theatre. Gales roll across it like drums. Waves rise like cathedrals. A ship here is not just a weapon. It is a world unto itself. The Royal Navy's HMS Hood was more than a warship. She was an icon of Britain. When launched in 1918, she was the largest and most graceful vessel afloat. 860 feet of sweeping decks and soaring masts, her silhouette instantly recognisable to sailors the world over. To the British people, she was simply the mighty Hood. For 2 decades, she had been the pride of the Royal Navy, the embodiment of sea power and the reassurance that Britannia still ruled the waves. She had circled the globe on goodwill tours, her arrival in foreign harbours drawing crowds who gasped at her sleek lines and towering presence. Children clambered onto quaysides to wave at her crew, while newspapers published photographs of her cutting majestically across the seas. She was not just a battleship, she was a floating ambassador of Britain's might. Inside her steel walls, over 1,400 men lived, worked, and laughed together. To them she was both fortress and home. They knew every echo of her engines, every tremor of her guns, every draught that whistled through her hatches. She was massive, yet she moved like a thoroughbred, surging through the waves at over 30 knots. faster than almost anything her size had a right to be. Her guns were the same caliber as those on Bismarck. 8 mighty 15-inch main guns, each capable of shattering an enemy at immense range. When they fired in broadside, the whole ship seemed to lurch sideways, smoke boiling, deck plates vibrating with raw energy. To stand beside those guns was to feel power itself unchained. And yet, it was not her steel or her firepower that bound Britain to her. It was her story. She had been there, at parades, at commemorations, as the visible shield of empire. In years of uncertainty, she was a constant. Parents pointed her out to their children as she steamed into view, her white ensign snapping in the wind. "That's the Hood," they would say. "She will keep us safe." For the men who sailed aboard her in 1941, there was pride in every glance at her decks, every time the sun caught her bridge. She was more than their ship. She was Britain's ship. And that pride, that bond between a nation and its greatest warship, made the tragedy of what was to come all the more unbearable. On Bismarck, over 2,000 men served, each with their own small universe of duty and fear. Some were boys barely out of school, standing watch in freezing spray. Others were stokers, deep in her belly, shoveling coal dust from their skin and wiping sweat from their eyes as turbines thundered. Officers polished binoculars and studied maps, aware that a single mistake might doom them all. On the British ships, the atmosphere was the same. Hood's mess decks hummed with talk, half bravado, half nerves. Prince of Wales carried new conscripts who had never fired their big guns in anger. Yet all shared one knowledge. Somewhere out there was a ship that could match them, and perhaps destroy them. Weaponry mattered. This was an age when steel and fire still decided empires. Hood, launched in 1918, yes, she carried those 8 15-inch guns, similar caliber to Bismarck's, albeit shorter barreled, and her armour was thinner, her design a relic of another war. She was fast, majestic, but vulnerable to plunging fire. Prince of Wales was newer, armed with 10 14-inch guns, but her systems were still untested. Her crew had trained hard, but many of her secondary weapons jammed in practice runs. Against them, Bismarck's main batteries were state-of-the-art. Each 15-inch gun barrel was over 60 feet long, longer than a city bus, firing armour-piercing shells at nearly 3,000 feet per second. When they struck, they could smash through battleship plating as if it were parchment. Her fire control systems, rangefinders, radars, computers, were finely tuned, giving her gunners precision at ranges most navies could only dream of. Every sailor on both sides understood. When these giants met, the result would not be a skirmish. It would be annihilation for someone. As Bismarck steamed north, shadowed by Prince Eugen, the chase began in earnest. British reconnaissance planes scoured the Norwegian fjords, their crews peering through mist and cloud. On 21st May, a Spitfire flying from Scotland caught sight of the German ships moored in Grimstad Fjord near Bergen. Grainy photographs confirmed it. Bismarck had entered the North Sea. Tovey's response was immediate. He ordered Hood and Prince of Wales to intercept via the Denmark Strait. Cruisers were dispatched to patrol likely escape routes, and the carrier Victorious, though carrying only a handful of Swordfish torpedo bombers, prepared for her chance to strike. Churchill, receiving the news, cabled the Admiralty, "You are to pursue the Bismarck at all costs. Bring her to action, sink her." It was not strategy now, it was a crusade. The Germans knew they were being watched. British submarines lurked along the Norwegian coast, and radio traffic betrayed tension in the Atlantic. Lutyens decided not to linger. On 21st May, Bismarck raised anchor and slid back into the open sea, her grey hull merging with mist and rain. One sailor later recalled standing on deck as the fjords faded. It felt like leaving shelter for the mouth of a wolf. The sea was endless, and we knew the enemy would come. But Bismarck was strong. She felt indestructible beneath my feet. The engines roared. The prow lifted against the swell. Westward she turned toward the Denmark Strait. And the hunt was on. The prow of the Bismarck cut through the grey Atlantic swells as she pressed westward, her great engines pounding deep within her hull. May the 22nd into the 23rd, the transition into the Denmark Strait, a cold and treacherous corridor of sea. To port, the white cliffs of Greenland, to starboard, the volcanic shadows of Iceland. Fog banks rolled across the water, heavy and shifting, cloaking one moment and clearing the next. This was a place of ghosts and ambushes. Prince Eugen kept station ahead, her silhouette sharp and angular. Together the two German ships moved with silent determination. Somewhere in the murk, they knew the Royal Navy was waiting. The first to find them were the British cruisers, Suffolk and Norfolk. Heavy cruisers, smaller than battleships, but fast, each armed with 8 8-inch guns. On the evening of May 23rd, Suffolk's radar, one of the newest in the Royal Navy, picked up a contact through the fog. A shadow at first, then a vast presence. The Bismarck. Captain Ellis of Suffolk acted instantly. He dared not close to visual range. Bismarck's guns would obliterate him in minutes. Instead, he turned away, ordered smoke, and kept her at arm's length, reporting every bearing, every change of course. Norfolk joined the pursuit, her own radar probing the gloom. Together the cruisers became bloodhounds, unseen but relentless, shadowing the giant at a distance, keeping her pinned until the heavier ships could converge. On Bismarck's bridge the reports came in. They were being shadowed. Lutyens scowled, but he did not break off. His orders were clear. Reach the open Atlantic. The faster he moved, the less time Britain would have to close the trap. The night rolled on. The cruisers clung to their prey, straining every circuit of their new radar sets, while their wireless officers fed bearings back to the home fleet. Dawn, 24th May, 1941. From the deck of HMS Hood, the world revealed itself in iron-grey light. Men shivered in the early chill, stamping their feet, mugs of cocoa steaming in the breeze. Hood, Britain's pride, cut through the waves at 28 knots. Behind her, slightly off to starboard, surged HMS Prince of Wales, younger, less proven, but powerful. On Hood's bridge stood Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, calm, austere, his cap pulled low. He had received the night's reports. The enemy was close, steaming southwest, and by morning they would cross paths. He knew the risks. Hood was the symbol of British sea power, but she was not invincible. Her design left her vulnerable to shells plunging down from long range. The solution, Holland reasoned, was simple: close the range fast. Bring the fight to short distances where Hood's speed and firepower might prevail. At 5:35 a.m, lookouts sighted shapes on the horizon, 2 grey specks emerging from mist and sea spray. The alarm spread in an instant. Bismarck and Prince Eugen. The order was given. Action stations. Sirens wailed. Doors clanged shut. Boots thundered on ladders. In the great gun turrets, crews slammed shells and propellant bags into breaches, checked elevation gears, swung the monstrous barrels toward the enemy. Men strapped on anti-flash hoods, pulled gloves over trembling hands. In the engine rooms the roar intensified, turbines spinning harder as stokers heaved coal and oil-fired boilers spat flame. The stage was set. At 5:52 a.m, Hood fired the first salvo. Her forward turrets belched flame and thunder, hurling massive 15-inch shells across the sea. The concussion rattled every plate and rivet in her frame. Prince of Wales followed, her new guns barking in defiance. On Bismarck's decks, the shock of impact moments later, huge geysers of water leapt around her hull as British shells plunged down. The German gunners, drilled to perfection, responded almost instantly. 4 turrets swung as one, rangefinders fixed, fire control computers whirring. A single command, and the great 15-inch guns spoke. The roar was like the world splitting open. Muzzles spat fire, the shockwave flattening spray in all directions. Shells streaked high into the sky, then curved downward in a deadly arc. The first exchanges were wild, shells falling short or long, water columns towering, but soon the gunners found their stride. Bismarck's fire control officers reported accurate straddles. Prinz Eugen added her own biting salvos of 8-inch shells, stitching the water near Hood. On Hood's deck, fragments clattered like rain. Men clenched their jaws, braced for the inevitable. Her gunners kept firing, the ship trembling with each recoil. The sea boiled with gunfire. Hood and Prince of Wales surged forward, their great turrets hammering, the air torn with concussion. Shells shrieked overhead like express trains, geysers rising in deadly curtains around the German ships. Bismarck answered, her own salvos cracking open the dawn. Each shot was a hammer blow of thunder that shook the bones of every man who heard it. On Hood's deck, the clang of shell cases, the bark of orders, the tremor of machinery. Smoke stung eyes, steel rang underfoot. Men braced behind armour that suddenly felt thin. And then, the moment. At 6 a.m, Bismarck's forward turrets loosed another salvo. 4 shells, each nearly a ton, howling across the sky. They arced downward, invisible until the last instant, then slammed into Hood. 1 shell struck near the mainmast, tearing through her decks, burrowing deep into the heart of the ship. There was silence for a heartbeat, a dreadful pause, and then the world erupted. Her aft magazines ignited, thousands of tons of cordite detonating in an instant. A sheet of flame taller than the masts blasted skyward, blinding, searing, incandescent. It ripped Hood in half. Plates curled like paper, turrets were hurled skyward, men obliterated where they stood. The fireball rolled upward in a pillar of orange and black, a volcano born of steel. For those aboard, Prince of Wales, watching from barely a mile away, it was horror beyond words. They saw their fleet's proudest ship convulse, her back breaking, her stern shearing away. In seconds the great hull was swallowed by fire and smoke. Hood, the mighty Hood, was gone, swallowed by the sea in barely 3 minutes. Where once had stood 1,400 men, voices, lives, laughter, there was nothing but wreckage and flame. Only 3 souls clawed their way to the surface, flung into the freezing water. The rest, over 1,000 fathers, sons, brothers, perished without a chance to cry out. The sea itself seemed stunned, boiling with oil and burning debris, smoke rising like a funeral pyre. On Prince of Wales, sailors gripped railings, some weeping openly, some frozen in disbelief. Hood had been their pride, their guardian, the visible symbol of Britain's might. To see her annihilated in a single apocalyptic blast, it was unthinkable. And in that unthinkable moment, grief turned to rage. There would be no mercy, no thought of retreat, no thought of balance. Bismarck had struck down the heart of the Royal Navy in front of their eyes. She had robbed Britain of its greatest ship, and with it 1,000 lives. From the Admiralty to the quarterdecks of destroyers, from Churchill himself to the lowest deckhand, a single iron vow hardened. The Bismarck would not escape. She would be found. She would be destroyed. She would be sent to the bottom of the sea, no matter the cost. The loss struck like a hammer blow. On Prince of Wales's bridge, officers stood aghast. One of the great symbols of British sea power had vanished in a single strike. Captain Leach, shaken but resolute, pressed the attack briefly, but his ship was battered. 7 heavy shells and several secondary hits had torn through her. Fires raged. Men lay bleeding on deck, and his guns were failing. Leach made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered smoke and turned away, Prince of Wales limping northward, battered but alive. On Bismarck's bridge, Lutyens remained expressionless. He had destroyed the Hood, a feat that would echo across the world. But he knew his own ship was not unscathed. Prince of Wales had scored at least 3 hits. 1 shell had torn through Bismarck's bows, flooding her forward oil tanks. Another crippled a boiler room. She was leaking fuel, her speed reduced. Worse, she left a trail of oil across the sea, a beacon for her hunters. Victory had come at a cost. News travelled fast. In London, Churchill was awoken with the report, his face, pale with shock, hardened to steel. "Sink the Bismarck," he ordered again. "Whatever it takes." Sink the Bismarck. The Admiralty echoed the call. Every available ship, from battleships to destroyers, was thrown into the chase. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, became a hunting ground. For the men at sea, it was personal now. On Suffolk and Norfolk, crews who had watched the distant flashes of the Denmark Strait fought their own emotions. Hood had been an icon, a giant whose name had carried pride through 2 decades. Now she was gone, lost with fathers, brothers, sons. Men clenched fists, muttered curses, swore vengeance. On Prince of Wales, the survivors of Hood's sinking were few, but their haunted faces told the tale. 3 men saved out of more than 1,400, their skin blistered, their bodies torn. And yet, despite her damage, Prince of Wales turned again to shadow the Germans, her crew grimly determined to keep eyes on their foe. Bismarck, though bloodied, pressed on. Her course turned south toward occupied France, where friendly ports and the Luftwaffe's air cover awaited. But she could not shake her pursuers. Suffolk, Norfolk, and the wounded Prince of Wales clung to her at the edge of vision, relaying her every move. At the helm of Bismarck, Lutyens grew increasingly frustrated. He sent signals back to Berlin, reporting the situation. Hitler's orders were maddeningly clear. Avoid unnecessary risks. Conserve the fleet. Yet here he was, one ship against the might of the Royal Navy, hunted across an ocean. He considered options. Detach Prince Eugen to continue commerce raiding, send Bismarck south alone. But nothing could change the fact that the enemy had her scent. Night fell again, and with it came the next attack. HMS Victorious, far to the west, had launched her Swordfish biplanes, frail, canvas and wire aircraft from another era. They staggered into the wind, wings flexing, crews wrapped in leather and goggles against the freezing air. It seemed ludicrous, these relics of the First World War against the most modern battleship afloat. But courage bridged the gap. Through sleet and storm, the Swordfish found their target. Against sheets of tracer fire, they dived, skimming the waves, torpedoes slung beneath their bellies. Engines rattling, cockpits shuddering, they pressed home. Bismarck's gunners spat fire, filling the sky with red and yellow streaks. One by one, the Swordfish dropped their torpedoes, streaking silver across the Black Sea. Explosions rocked Bismarck's hull, not crippling, but bruising. One sailor aboard described the impact. It was like the earth itself struck us. Plates shook, light bulbs shattered, and the air grew thick with dust and cordite. The Swordfish limped back into the night, several riddled with holes, but against all odds, most returned. Bismarck, battered anew, still sailed on. Yet the tide was turning. Her fuel leaks worsened, her speed fell further. The ocean, vast as it was, offered no sanctuary when the enemy was relentless. The Royal Navy smelled blood and the chase intensified. Destroyers closed in, darting like wolves around a wounded bear. Battleships. Renown and King George V surged south, racing to cut her off. Even ships from the Mediterranean and America were alerted. Across thousands of miles, the world's mightiest navy converged on one target. The hunter had become the hunted. By dawn on May 25th, Bismarck was alone. Prince Eugen had detached into the mist, slipping away to continue raiding. The great battleship pressed on by herself, southward toward France, toward Brest. But the British would not let go. The shadowing cruisers tracked her still. Signals flashed across the Atlantic, and Churchill's words echoed in every wardroom, every gun turret, every soul who stood watch on salt-crusted decks. Sink the Bismarck. And so the hunt continued. The morning of May 25th brought a cruel twist of fortune. Through the night, Bismarck had shaken her shadows. Suffolk, Norfolk, and the battered Prince of Wales lost contact in the fog and confusion. Their radars failed to hold her. For a moment it seemed the German battleship had slipped the noose. In London and Scapa Flow, tension turned to despair. Admirals pored over charts, cursing the endless ocean. Where had she gone? South to Brest? West into the Atlantic? The home fleet scattered across 100 possible courses, burning fuel, straining engines, searching for a ghost in a grey wilderness. Admiral Tovey himself admitted privately, "We may never see her again." But luck has its limits. On the morning of May 26th, a Catalina flying boat of Coastal Command, sweeping the Atlantic on a long patrol, sighted her. A dark streak on a restless sea. The Bismarck. Still heading for France, still leaving that telltale oil slick. The call went out. Position fixed. The hunt resumed with renewed fury. The nearest ship with a chance to intercept was HMS Royal, a carrier, her decks lined with the humble Swordfish biplanes. The same relics that had bloodied Bismarck once before. Late that afternoon they launched again. The weather was brutal. Squalls, high winds, sheets of rain. The Swordfish wavered and tossed like paper kites, crews drenched, goggles streaked with spray. Yet they pressed on. One weathered pilot muttered through clenched teeth, "We'll either sink her or drown trying." At 8:47 p.m. they found their target. Bismarck loomed below, vast and defiant, her anti-aircraft guns blazing in a frenzy of fire. Tracers ripped the sky. The old biplanes should have been slaughtered, yet their slow speed made them strangely resilient. Shells timed for faster aircraft overshot, bursting harmlessly behind. The Swordfish pressed in, one by one, dropping torpedoes at mast height, their engines whining in protest. Explosions slammed into the sea, some striking her hull with thunderclaps that reverberated for miles. One struck aft. A shudder passed through Bismarck, deeper, more final than before. Her rudder jammed. She was locked in a slow circle. On her bridge the truth dawned, with dreadful clarity. The great battleship could still steam, could still fire, but she could no longer steer. She was crippled. A prize catch now, waiting for the hammer blow. Night fell again, the sea grew wilder, gale-force winds shrieking, waves crashing over decks, destroyers closed in, darting like wolves. British ships launched torpedo attacks in the darkness, hammering at the stricken giant. Men on Bismarck's decks stood to their posts, wet to the bone, firing into the blackness at fleeting shadows. Shells roared, tracers hissed, but the attacks kept coming. All through the night, the Royal Navy hounded her, softening her, bleeding her strength. Her men fought with stoic discipline, but each impact deepened the inevitability. By dawn, May 27th, the end was certain. On the horizon, massive silhouettes emerged: HMS King George V, Admiral Tovey's flagship; HMS Rodney, a long-serving campaigner, bristling with 9 16-inch guns, each capable of smashing a fortress. Alongside them came cruisers, Dorsetshire and Norfolk, destroyers snapping at their heels. A firing squad of the sea, converging on one wounded beast. At 8:47 a.m, Rodney opened fire. The great battleship bucked as her 16-inch guns roared, hurling shells heavier than small cars across the distance. King George V joined in, her own salvos streaking out. A storm of fire engulfed the horizon. Bismarck answered. Her forward turrets spat flame, her shells straddling Rodney at first. But her list, her jammed rudder, her damaged fire control, all betrayed her. Accuracy faltered. British shells closed in. The bombardment became an execution. Rodney and King George V fired at point-blank range for battleships, less than 3 miles. Shells crashed into Bismarck's superstructure, tearing it apart. Masts toppled. Guns were blasted from turrets. Steel twisted and shrieked. Fires roared uncontrolled, black smoke boiling upward. On deck, German sailors fought through chaos, loading shells, manning guns, dragging wounded comrades clear of flames. Some fired machine guns at the oncoming storm, a futile defiance. Others simply prayed. A midshipman aboard Rodney later wrote, "It was like watching a lion brought low, proud even in its dying, but beaten beyond hope. We poured salvo after salvo into her, and still she fought. God help the men inside." For over an hour the Royal Navy pounded her. More than 2,800 shells were fired. By the end, Bismarck was a ruin, her upper works obliterated, her guns twisted wrecks. Yet her flag still flew. The final blow came from torpedoes. Dorsetshire closed in, launching 2, then a third, slamming into the mangled hull. Water rushed in. Deep within, scuttling charges set by her surviving crew detonated. At 10:40 a.m, the great ship rolled to port, her stern lifting high. Men leapt into the freezing sea, hundreds of them, their cries carried on the wind. Bismarck heeled over, her flag still visible, as the water closed above her. With a hiss of bubbles, a roar of imploding air, she was gone. Over 2,000 men had served aboard. Fewer than 120 were pulled from the water. Hundreds more cried for help as British ships withdrew, fearing U-boat attacks. The sea became their grave. News raced across the world. In Britain, church bells rang. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices, cheering headlines scrawled in ink. Bismarck sunk. For a nation reeling from the loss of Hood, it was deliverance. Proof that Britain could still strike back, could still endure. In Germany, the announcement was met with sombre silence. Propaganda hailed Bismarck's defiance. But the truth was bitter. Their greatest battleship had gone down on her first mission, a colossal loss of men and pride. In the aftermath, questions lingered. Why had Lütjens pressed on instead of retreating? Could the ship have been saved had she sought refuge in Norway? Should Hitler have built such giants at all, when U-boats were proving more lethal and less vulnerable? Naval historians still debate these points, but the broader lesson is clear. The age of the battleship was passing. Bismarck, for all her might, was undone not by another battleship alone, but by fragile aircraft, biplanes more at home in 1917 than 1941. The balance of naval warfare was shifting irrevocably to the air. For Britain, the victory carried both triumph and tragedy. Hood lay at the bottom of the Denmark Strait, with nearly all her men. The Royal Navy had won, but at terrible cost, and yet there remains something almost mythical in the story of Bismarck. The scale of her, the fear she inspired, the drama of her chase, all became legend. Songs were written, films produced, books filled with retellings. She was remembered not only as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of the age, the last great titan of steel to stride the seas before aircraft carriers reigned supreme. One survivor, years later, reflected from the quiet of peacetime. She was a fortress, a home, a death trap, and a legend all at once. We thought she was invincible, but no ship is invincible. The sea claims all in the end. The North Atlantic returned to its emptiness. The waves closed over wrecks, over oil slicks, over the scattered lifeboats of both Hood and Bismarck. Silence reclaimed the straits, broken only by gulls and wind. But in memory, in history, the thunder of that hunt echoes still. A reminder of courage and folly, of human skill and human loss, of the strange poetry of war at sea. Today the Bismarck lies broken on the abyssal plain, 3 miles beneath the restless Atlantic. Her shattered hull is strewn across the seabed, turrets blown clear, steel twisted like bone. Around her lie the silent relics of battle, helmets, boots, fragments of lives cut short. No sunlight will ever reach her, only the cold pressure of the deep, the slow creep of rust, and the eternal silence of the dead. She rests there still, not as the invincible fortress she once seemed, but as a tomb, a monument to vengeance fulfilled, to pride, to sacrifice, and to the unforgiving judgment of the sea. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.